Welcome to your custom deep dive. We have an incredibly fascinating stack of research in front of us
We
today,
really do.
and it was brought to us by you, the listener. You've handed us a pretty complex collection of excerpts exploring the legacy of a biblical figure named Onan,
Right.
plus some ancient biological theories and the evolution of sacred law. Our mission today is to take these texts and unpack how early scientific misunderstandings shaped some profoundly strict religious rules.
And more importantly, we are going to look at how those ancient traditions scramble to adapt when modern science comes along and completely rewrites the foundational facts of reality.
Okay, let's unpack this because if you mention the story of Onan today, pop culture has a very superficial, almost entirely sexualized reading of it. I
Definitely.
mean, the term onanism literally derives from his name and is almost exclusively linked to the prohibition of masturbation.
That's the common takeaway, yeah.
But looking through the historical and legal commentary you provided, the actual history is a gripping tale of social contracts, ancient genetics, and what a skeptic might call theological moving goalposts.
It's a masterclass in adaptation, which is what makes this specific deep dive so compelling. We aren't just doing a history lesson about a single story from the book of Genesis. We are looking at the mechanics of human meaning-making.
Exactly.
When you have a system, whether it is religious, legal, or cultural, that bases its absolute moral laws on the science of its day, what happens when that science is proven wrong?
Does the whole system collapse?
Right. And the story of Onan provides the perfect lens to watch a massive institution navigate a scientific revolution in real time over the course of centuries.
Let's start by looking at the true crime of Onan, because that surface-level pop culture reading completely misses the harsh reality of the ancient Near East.
It really does.
In Genesis 38, Onan is punished by God with death. For centuries, the layman's assumption was that the punishment was purely for the physical act of spilling his seed.
Which ignores the context.
Entirely. However, the Jewish tradition, if we look at the Midrash, the Talmud, and medieval commentators like Rashi, they argue that Onan's punishment was fundamentally about greed, economic exploitation, and a staggering lack of empathy.
To fully grasp the motive, we have to look at the ancient social safety net, specifically a legal practice called levirate marriage, known in Hebrew as yibum.
Right, Yibum.
In this agrarian tribal society, land and lineage were everything. A woman had virtually no independent economic agency. If her husband died before they had children, she was incredibly vulnerable.
She couldn't just inherit his estate and live independently.
Exactly. So the law required the deceased man's brother to marry the widow. Onan had an older brother named who died childless.
So by law, Onan was required to marry Ur's widow, Tamar.
Yes. And the explicit legal goal of this arrangement was to father a child who would carry the dead brother's name and inherit his portion of the family estate. It was designed to protect the widow and ensure the deceased lineage wasn't erased.
That context changes the entire framing of the story. Onan knew exactly how the inheritance math worked.
He knew the math.
He knew that if he fathered a child with Tamar, that child would inherit Ur's portion of the land and wealth. But if Tamar remained childless, that portion of the estate would eventually default to Onan himself, significantly increasing his own wealth and power.
So he went into this marriage with a highly calculated plan.
A terrible one. He used Tamar for his own sexual gratification, but deliberately engaged in the withdrawal method to ensure no child was ever conceived.
He was systematically denying her the legal protection, the social status, and the financial security of motherhood in a society where that was her literal lifeline.
It was a brutal, sustained act of psychological and economic cruelty.
Weaponizing her vulnerability for a real estate grab.
Yes. The research you sent over highlights a brilliant hypothetical question regarding Jewish law, or halakha, that really drives this home.
I love this hypothetical.
What if Onan had already given Tamar an heir? Let's say the legal duty of Yibum was fulfilled, Tamar's future was secure, and Ur's estate had an heir.
Okay.
If Onan and Tamar were just living as a standard married couple, and he occasionally utilized the withdrawal method afterward, would that have triggered a divine death sentence?
From a strict halakhic perspective, the consensus is almost certainly no.
Because the debt to the deceased brother would have been paid.
Exactly. The Jewish legal perspective sees Onan's death as a punishment for theft, deceit, and heartlessness. He was actively sabotaging a sacred mechanism meant to protect a vulnerable widow, all while pretending to fulfill his duty.
What's fascinating here is that while wasting seed was absolutely a serious concern in Jewish law, Outside of this high-stakes context of the Levirate obligation and the sheer malice involved, it wasn't traditionally treated as a capital crime.
Right, the extreme outcome in the biblical narrative was a reaction to the systemic betrayal.
But we cannot ignore that the physical act itself still carried an enormous amount of moral weight in the ancient world, completely independent of Tamar's situation.
Very true.
And that brings us to the underlying science of the era. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The biology.
Yes. To understand why the act carried such heavy moral baggage, we have to pivot to the prevailing biological understanding of the ancient world, the soil and seed theory.
This was the dominant scientific framework held by the ancient Greeks, championed by philosophers like Aristotle, and widely accepted by early Jewish thinkers.
Today we know reproduction is a combination of materials from both partners.
Right, half and half.
But the ancients had a totally different, highly asymmetrical framework. They believed that the male contribution, the semen, contained the entire blueprint of a human being.
Some later variations of this idea even posited a homunculus.
A homunculus, right, a microscopic, fully formed person curled up inside.
In that ancient scientific paradigm, the female role was drastically misunderstood. The woman was viewed essentially as an incubator. She was the soil.
The soil for the seed.
Exactly. Just as a farmer plants a literal wheat seed into the earth, and the earth merely provides a warm, moist environment and nutrients for the seed to grow, they believed the male seed just needed the womb for physical matter and nourishment.
The ovum was completely unknown to them.
Completely. The idea that the woman contributed half of the genetic architecture of the child was unfathomable.
When you apply that 100% blueprint theory to their legal code, you instantly see why wasting seed was viewed with such terror.
It makes total sense within their framework.
If every single emission is a fully formed human life just waiting to be planted in the soil, then wasting it isn't just a minor biological inefficiency, it is a form of proto-homicide.
Yes.
The texts you provided pull a jarring quote from the Talmud, specifically Tractate Niddah 13a, which states, "One who emits semen in vain is as if he shed blood."
They were quite literally equating it to murder, or at the very least, manslaughter. It's a perfectly logical, internally consistent conclusion based entirely on the flawed science they had at their disposal.
If you genuinely believe you are discarding a finished human life, you legislate against it with the utmost severity.
But the texts also reveal a crucial, sophisticated nuance in their thinking that prevents this from being a purely mechanical biological law.
This is my favorite part of the research.
Even back then, despite this strict homicide biology, Jewish law explicitly permitted and even encouraged marital intimacy during pregnancy or postmenopause.
That is a massive theological detail.
Right.
In both of those situations, it is biologically impossible for the seed to take root and produce a child. If the only purpose of intimacy was to plant the seed, those acts would logically be considered a waste.
Precisely. This proves that even with their limited biological knowledge, the tradition recognized that intimacy had a vital relational value independent of procreation.
They held these two concepts simultaneously.
Yes, the seed is sacred potential life requiring intense protection, but the marital bond has its own independent sanctity that must be nurtured even when procreation is off the table.
So we have this ancient world functioning on the soil and seed theory. But then the scientific floor falls out.
Science marches on.
The microscope is invented. We discover the ovum. We eventually understand meiosis, the process of cell division where a sperm cell only carries 23 chromosomes, exactly 50% of the genetic code.
And the egg provides the other 50%, plus the active cellular environment to build the embryo.
The seed is definitively not a microscopic person. It is just half of a puzzle.
Right.
So how did the religious institutions adapt when their foundational biology was proven wrong? The research maps out a fascinating denominational split in how modern Judaism handles this ancient rule today.
It serves as a perfect case study in legal evolution and institutional survival. Let's start with Orthodox Judaism, which maintains strict adherence to traditional halakha.
Okay.
The prohibition against wasting seed remains firmly in place, but because the underlying science changed, the theological reasoning had to shift.
They transitioned from the ancient argument of homicide, since the seed is no longer a full human, to an argument of holiness and intent.
Exactly. The rule is maintained as a divine decree, a gezerah, but the modern focus is on channeling creative energy properly and maintaining the sanctity of the marital act.
And understanding that the focus shifted to intent explains the modern medical exceptions they've carved out.
It really does.
For example, providing a sample for In vitro fertilization, or IVF, where an egg is fertilized in a lab, or intra-uterine insemination, IUI. Many Orthodox rabbis permit these procedures because the ultimate intent is the creation of life.
That is the crucial pivot. The intent aligns with the core value of the original law, even if the physical extraction process involves what the ancients would have fiercely condemned as wasting seed.
And what about the other denominations?
Well, if we look at conservative Judaism, they take a more evolutionary historical approach. They openly acknowledge that the ancient biological premise was factually incorrect.
They respect the traditional values of family and marital intimacy, but they use the ancient rule more as a moral guidepost rather than enforcing it as a rigid capital crime.
Balancing the weight of tradition with modern psychological and scientific understandings of human sexuality.
Then you have Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism, which lean heavily into personal autonomy and a science-first perspective.
Yes.
In those denominations, the concept of wasting seed is completely detached from the story of Onan. They view reproductive material simply as biological components.
So what happens to the story of Onan for them?
The story is reclaimed entirely as a moral lesson about consent, bodily autonomy, and economic exploitation. The focus has returned squarely to his abusive treatment of Tamar, stripping away the Aristotelian biology entirely.
When you synthesize all of this, the legacy of the story is remarkable. Across almost all branches today, Genesis 38 is rarely taught as a biological imperative.
The institution survived the scientific revolution by either adjusting the rationale for the law or reinterpreting the core lesson of the narrative.
That brings up a massive tension between religion and science, or the tension between revealed truth and discovered truth.
It really does, because to a secular, highly empirical mind, when the scientific reasoning behind a rule is proven demonstrably false, but the institution keeps the rule and just invents a new mystical reason for it, it looks exactly like post hoc justification.
Right.
It looks like moving the goalposts to avoid admitting they were wrong for 2,000 years.
It absolutely looks that way from the outside. But religious traditions have a very robust, sophisticated theological defense for this process, which the historical commentary outlines beautifully.
Walk us through that.
First, there is the concept we can call the intuition of the sacred. Theologians argue that the ancient incorrect biology was really just a placeholder.
A placeholder for what?
They believe humanity always possessed a divine intuition that certain acts, like exploiting a widow or trivializing the mechanisms of life, were a violation of a sacred bond. The ancients simply used the best science available to them at the time, soil and seed theory, to put vocabulary to that feeling.
So when the science updated, they didn't see themselves as making up excuses. They saw themselves as refining the explanation of an eternal moral truth that they had always intuited.
Exactly. I also see the teleological argument in these notes, which focuses on the inherent purpose or the trajectory of an act.
The logic here is that even if the DNA is only a 50% contribution, the biological purpose of the act is oriented toward the creation of life.
Therefore, intentionally short-circuiting that natural process is a violation of its inherent nature, regardless of the specific chromosomal math.
And finally, there is the argument of continuity, which is essentially the fear of the slippery slope.
Right.
If a religious authority admits we were 100% wrong about the foundational science of this major law, it threatens the entire architecture of the faith. People start asking, if you were wrong about biology, what else are you wrong about? Dietary laws, the afterlife.
That continuity is the lifeblood of institutions that seek to preserve a specific generational way of life. They are inherently conservative systems. They are designed to maintain stability in a chaotic world.
The research provided this incredible analogy to visualize this tension, and I want to spend some time on it because it makes this massive philosophical concept so tangible.
The anchor in the boat.
Yes, think of the relationship between ancient religious law and modern science like an anchor in a boat. The anchor is the fixed moral rule, in this case, do not waste the potential for life.
Okay.
The anchor is dropped, it is secured to the seafloor, and it does not move.
And the chain.
The chain connecting the anchor to the boat represents the theological reasoning or the justification, and the water is the current state of human scientific knowledge.
It is an elegant metaphor. As the water of science shifts, rises, and forms new currents, the boat on the surface naturally has to move.
But the anchor stays exactly where it is.
The chain, the reasoning, simply changes its angle or stretches to keep the boat attached to that same original point on the seafloor.
The water changed from the seed is 100% of a fully formed microscopic person to the seed is 50% of the genetic code.
So the chain shifted its angle.
Exactly. From wasting it as homicide to wasting it violates holiness and marital intent. The boat moved to accommodate the new water level, but the anchor held fast to the seafloor.
Before we move into the final section of our deep dive, we need to acknowledge that applying this metaphor to our next topic involves one of the most politically and emotionally charged debates in modern society: the debate over abortion and when human life, legally and morally, begins.
We should be very clear with you listening. Our goal here is not to endorse any specific political viewpoint or take a stance. We are simply imparting the ideas and historical shifts contained in the source material you provided, showing impartially how these ancient systems process scientific change.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, with that context in mind, let's trace that evolution.
If we look at early Jewish thought from thousands of years ago, life was inextricably tied to breath.
The Hebrew word neshama intimately connects the concepts of soul and breath.
Without visible, independent breathing, an embryo wasn't legally seen as a separate, fully realized person. The text points to the book of Exodus, chapter 21. It outlines a scenario where two men are fighting and accidentally strike a pregnant woman, causing a miscarriage.
And the biblical penalty for causing that miscarriage is a financial property fine paid to the husband. It is explicitly not a murder charge.
The rabbinic principle here was ubar yirik imo, meaning the fetus was considered a limb or an extension of the mother's body.
But jump forward to today. With 4D ultrasound technology and rapid DNA sequencing, the primary justification in many conservative religious circles has shifted entirely.
The argument is now frequently anchored to the idea that life begins at the exact moment a unique genetic code is formed.
We see a parallel evolution involving the concept of ensoulment, a theory heavily influenced by Aristotle.
He theorized that a soul entered a developing male fetus at 40 days and a female fetus at 90 days.
For centuries, both Catholic and Jewish authorities used this accepted science to inform their legal frameworks, often treating early-term terminations vastly differently than late-term ones, based entirely on this 40 or 90-day threshold.
But when the microscope arrived and modern genetics proved that the complete architectural blueprint is present from the very first second of fertilization, religious authorities had to react.
The water shifted dramatically, so they moved the conclusion to the moment of conception. The chain changed its angle to secure the boat.
But then modern biology threw another massive, unforeseen hurdle at that new reasoning. Advanced medical imaging and reproductive science revealed that the vast majority of fertilized eggs, zygotes with a unique genetic code, naturally fail to implant in the uterine wall.
They pass out of the body, often without the woman ever knowing conception briefly occurred.
The theological implication of this is staggering. If every single fertilized zygote is a full, legally ensouled person, then nature itself, or God by design, is a prolific killer.
The sheer mathematical scale of natural embryo loss creates a massive logical problem, for the strict life begins at conception argument.
This specific biological reality forced what the texts refer to as the potentiality pivot.
Instead of abandoning the anchor, theologians adjusted the chain once again.
They pivoted away from a strictly biological claim to a deeply philosophical one. They began to argue that because the zygote could become a person, it possesses inherent potentiality, and therefore must be treated with the dignity and protection of a full person.
They moved from the rigid biological fact of it is currently a person to the philosophical value of it could become a person, so we must treat it as one.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you spend your time parsing through ancient liverate marriage contracts or Aristotle's deeply flawed theories on embryology?
It's a fair question.
Whether you are examining shifting reproductive ethics or looking at something as mundane as ancient dietary laws, like how the ban on eating pork shifted over time from it causes trichinosis to it, is simply a divine decree meant to separate us and make us holy. Understanding how institutions argue is just as important as knowing what they argue.
It highlights our deep, almost desperate human drive for consistency.
We live in a world of relentless, ever-changing information, and these institutional mechanisms show how badly we want our moral foundations to remain steady, even when the floor beneath them gets completely replaced by new discoveries.
It is a profound psychological impulse. We need the anchor. But looking at the trajectory of these adaptations leaves us with a critical, lingering thought to consider, something that pushes beyond the texts we've reviewed today.
Let's hear it.
If the water of human knowledge keeps rising, and the chain of justification keeps stretching and changing angles to accommodate it, what happens when the water changes completely? Imagine a near future with widespread use of artificial wombs or CRISPR genetic editing where we can synthetically write human DNA from scratch.
Wow.
If the biological processes of reproduction become entirely synthetic, does the chain finally snap? Is there a breaking point where the anchor of an ancient rule must finally be lifted from the seafloor, or will human ingenuity always find a way to forge a longer chain to connect our ancient past to our science fiction future?
That is a brilliant and slightly terrifying question to end on. Thank you so much for bringing us such an incredible stack of research today. Keep questioning the foundations, keep exploring the history of ideas, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.